Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Poland Daily History. Today we are at the Warsaw Citadel, a structure built by the Russians in the 1830s and later on used as a prison for political dissidents and fighters of the January uprising of 1863 to 1864. Some of the prisoners held here would later on become prominent figures in Polish politics, while others were executed or sent to Siberia after imprisonment. Today, we will talk to some of the experts about the specifics of the Citadel, the January Uprising, and more history about the era. During the January Uprising, most of the foreign support for Poland is from France and Italy. I was wondering if you can tell me more about that.
Kontakty polsko-włoskie jeszcze przed powstaniem styczniowym.
Polish-Italian relations before the January Uprising were related to the officers' school in Cuneo and Genoa and Ludwik Mirosławski, who made numerous contacts there. When the actual uprising erupted, the Poles turned to Giuseppe Garibaldi, hoping he would help them.
Licząc na to, że on ich wspomoże. Garibaldi nie pozostał obojętny.
Garibaldi did not remain indifferent to Poland's situation, even though an aristocratic upbringing wasn't ideal for him, because he was aware that the uprising was called for by the aristocracy and nobility, which Garibaldi, putting it lightly, wasn't a fan of. He dealt with the uprising problem by sending his son together with a unit of volunteers. The unit was commanded by his trusted general Francesco Nullo, one of the people who took part in Risorgimento, the Italian unification. An incredibly experienced and brave soldier, he led the so-called Garibaldi Legion. This was a unit mostly made up of Italians from Bergamo in the northeast, Garibaldi's compatriots. They fought bravely in a number of clashes with the Russian army. Unfortunately, Francesco Nullo himself was heroically killed in the Battle of Krzykawka. Nullo's adjutant, Elia Marchetti, who unsuccessfully tried to shield him, survived and was one of the prisoners of the 10th Pavilion and was later one of the many veterans who were forcibly deported to Siberia. General Nullo was honored with a monument that stands in Warsaw today. He was a particularly popular figure in the interwar period.
So what about the support from France?
Francuzi również pomagali, nawet dosyć chętnie.
The French also helped the Poles willingly. One of the 5 protesters killed in the protest preceding the uprising, one of the so-called 5 fallen ones. So, one of the people who gave his life in the first mass protest on the streets of Warsaw was a Polish journeyman of French background on his father's side. This man gave his life. If we are talking about people who actually fought in the January Uprising, then one character of monumental proportions appears to be François de Rochebrune, who commanded a very famous unit known as the Zouawi Śmierci, or Zouaves of Death. This was a unit of warriors from the French war in Algeria, and the Rochebrune himself was a former commander of the French Foreign Legion. He arrived in Poland as the head of a very well-schooled unit of soldiers. To be able to get in, Poles who also fought in the Zouawi Śmierci unit had to be able to shoot a coin thrown in the air in 1 or 2 shots. This eliminated those who weren't very good at shooting, so the Zouawi Śmierci unit was fairly elitist and did not have many people in it, because not many could meet the criteria to join it. 90% of its members consisted of hunters. The French ran it, although Poles had equal rights. A very nice suggestive photo of the officers from the Zouawi Śmierci taken in the ruins of the Monastery of the Holy Cross was preserved, with François de Rochebrune as one of the main figures in it. What else is there to say? The French involvement during the January Uprising was basically Rochebrune. After the fall of the January Uprising, many people moved to France following the Great Migration because they believed they would receive help from the residents there. This varied. While after the previous Polish uprising against the Russians in 1831 and 1832, the French were happy to take Poles in the 1860s, this got more political and unpleasant, as Napoleon III was more interested in fraternizing with the Russian Tsar and signing trade deals with Russia. That's why some of the French shed blood in their January uprising, but did not provide much help to combatants of the uprising.
The Poles in the struggle of the January uprising were not without their allies. Foreign aids played an important role in the historical event and further emphasized its significance. Here with us is the historian Dr. Krzysztof Jabłonka, giving us more insight on the contributions of Italy and France during the event. After the outbreak of the January uprising, many of the Poles are expecting outside help from the foreign countries. Did they ever come? Did that ever happen? And if we did get foreign aid, in what forms and where do they come from?
Początkowo powstanie cieszyło się ogromnym entuzjazmem.
At first, European nations and governments reacted with great enthusiasm about the uprising. The French Napoleonic government, whose emperor was Napoleon III, Napoleon the Great's nephew, as well as Palmerston's British government, wrote to the Tsarist government to get out of these lands. The Tsarist government ignored this, even though it had been recently defeated in the Crimean War by the Western powers, and the Russians had concerns that if these nations push the issue further, they will have to retreat.
I tu niestety największym wrogiem Polaków okazali się jak zwykle Prusacy.
The Poles' biggest enemy, as usual, were the Prussians, who made a secret deal in St. Petersburg through General Gustav von Alvensleben in February 1863 to mutually support each other in fighting off the Poles. The uprising didn't occur in the Prussian partition, but any attempts to cross the border to take part in the uprising were actively combated by the Prussians. As well as this, the Prussians were supplying the Russian army when they fought the Poles. They informed them where they could find various units of the uprising. They logistically and militarily supported the Tsarist army in the fight against the Poles.
Walkę z Polakami toczoną przez wojska carskie. Ciekawą postawę zawarła Austria.
The reaction of Austria was interesting. They decided to support the Western powers because they feared Russian domination in the Balkans. The Austrians also demanded the Tsar withdraw from Polish lands.
Od wojsk od cara wycofania się z ziem Rzeczpospolitej. Wsparli czynnie, nie tylko dyplomatycznie, najbardziej Włosi.
The Italians showed their support the most, not just diplomatically, but also actively. A few hundred Italians under the leadership of General Francesco Nullo went to Poland to help the Poles. About 500 Hungarians fought in the Polish uprising, as well as a few dozen Swedes, mostly military doctors. Great Britain equipped and sent 2 ships with reinforcements and equipment, the Emily and the Ward Jackson, which managed to get through to the Lithuanian coast via ports in Malmö and Copenhagen, and around 300 migrants and foreigners supporting Poland landed in the Lithuanian port of Połąga, among them the Russian Mikhail Bakunin, who claimed he fought for Poland because he loved Russia.
Niech był Rosjanin Bakunin, który walczył o Polskę, ponieważ kochał Rosję, jak twierdził. Również opinia rosyjska się podzieliła.
Feelings in Russia were mixed, alongside the opinion that everything Polish must be fought off and the Poles were Slavic traitors. There was an appeal published in Alexander Herzen's periodical Kolokol to fight along with the Poles because they were fighting the Tsar for freedom of the Russian people.
Za nas walczą z caratem o wolność ludu rosyjskiego.
Caucasian nations fought in defense of Poland as they intensified their own armed struggle against the Russians, and by doing so drew an entire Russian corps, originally intended to suppress the uprising, on themselves. Finally, the Danubian nations should be mentioned, so Moldova and Wallachia, which hadn't united into the state of Romania yet. They quietly supported the uprising, but fearing Russia, decided against allowing through around 5,000 rifles, which Napoleon had sent to help the Poles. So there was help, but it turned out not to be enough.
Jednak pomoc była, ale okazała się niewystarczająca.
The January uprising was one of the most pivotal moments in the era when Poland was partitioned. The Poles would later on spend decades debating whether or not they had taken the correct path of resistance. During the interwar era, the veterans were treated as heroes, and they would later on serve as an inspiration for the soldiers fighting in the 1944 Warsaw Uprising. That's it for today. I'll see you next time on Poland Daily History.